Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Virtue Signal. I'm Bill Whittle here with my friend Alfonso Rachel. And this show is where we talk about some of the kind of foundational philosophy and morality about what a decent society might look like. We're covering the classics first, 7 Deadly Sins and 7 Cardinal Virtues. As we move on, we'll start to look at specific political issues, but we figured it'd be best to just kind of lay the groundwork first. So, Zoe, here's a all-time crowd-pleasing favorite, especially in these days. The virtue of generosity as a sort of as an antidote to greed. Why don't we just take it on the fundamental level first in terms of just financial greed and financial generosity? Because I think there are other kinds of greed and other kinds of generosity.
Sure.
There's nothing wrong with making money, is there?
I don't think so. No.
So at what point does the rewards of hard work become greed?
Well, it's greed according to who, though? You know, because there's the perception of greed that has to be dealt with also. When we talk about greed, it's almost like gluttony, right? It's like, well,
right.
It almost seems a little redundant, right? I would say that, and I don't want to split hairs here and try to make some big distinction between the two, but gluttony is like, you can be gluttonous with your own resources, right? Greed, on the other hand, is when you can't seem to be satisfied and you start resorting to nefarious means to get what it is you want to satisfy your greed. And then, like I said, and then from there, it's people's perception of what it is that you're doing to be greedy. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and you've touched on something that we touched on with gluttony and lust, and it comes down to more than you need to be satisfied. This idea that the 7 deadly sins are desires of the flesh that are normal and natural within the bounds of moderation and sanity. But it seems like virtually all of these become deadly sins when they become obsessive and they kind of outstep the bounds of sort of the natural desire. For in the case of greed, people would like to do well, they'd like to make money and so on. But greed is a vice because it exceeds the limits of moderation. In other words, you put together a company, you work hard, and you want to make a good profit at it, and so on. But then you come to the point where you start thinking, well, maybe if I paid my contractors less, or if I cheated on this, or if I did that, and it's no longer satisfaction, like you said, no longer being satisfied with enough. No matter how much that is, you always have to have more. It's kind of same kind of an addiction.
Sure. And greed, is almost like the ugly kid of the union of gluttony and lust. And also you could throw pride in the mix too. Different dynamics that come along with it. And like I said, greed, like with gluttony, you can be gluttonous with your own resources, whereas greed is when you're tapping into covetousness, is when you're tapping into different means of what you want to do to get to. It can either be to get what somebody else has, or you're trying to get your own, but you can't get enough of it, and you resort to things like you get these things by ill-gotten gain. That's when greed really starts to come in, and that I think that's the big distinction between like gluttony. Like I said, you be gluttonous with your own resources. Greed is when you're trying to ascertain resources using or means to get it that are outside of what would be decent.
Right. And if the accompanying virtue is generosity, then I know it sounds like a circular definition, but you can say that greed is the absence of generosity. Generosity is maybe easier to understand than greed. Generosity is basically not only being willing to assist people who you deem worthy of assistance, but being almost lavish in that assistance. And it kind of comes down to, as all of them do, I guess, to where the center of your universe is. Is it in yourself? Are you the center of the universe? Are you the center of all of the money and all the desire and all of the food have to come directly to you? Or are you a person who's more sort of outward flowing in terms of their emotional state?
Sure. And along with that, though, Bill, generosity itself, can we really say that generosity is a virtue, especially when we're talking about, where does this staple of or this standard of generosity come from? Generosity, a person can be generous, but a person can be generous with other person's stuff that they've gotten by ill-gotten gains. You know what I'm saying? That's like a drug.
But that's not real generosity, though, is it? I mean that's like saying. That's kind of like the generosity of the state, right? We're gonna take this money from you at gunpoint, and we're gonna give it to people presumably in need. And look how virtuous and how wonderful we are. It's all coercion.
Sure. Actual
real generosity is not just a willingness. It's kind of a joy, right? It's that sense that it is better to give than to receive, and the sensation you get from giving somebody a present that really moves them and makes them happy is always feels better than getting one for yourself.
Absolutely. That's it. Now, that's where we come to butting heads with people, because what you just said is absolutely generosity to these people. I mean, what can be a better state of generosity when the society comes together and makes it law that we have to be our brother's keeper? I mean, that's an institution of generosity right there. Now, as far as they're concerned, that is people coming together and we have made generosity law. What's more virtuous than that? So, but we know, Bill, that the bottom line is that that's an institution of covetousness. And the Lord himself says, look, I've given to you freely. Sorry to repeat myself, but I got to do it, man. It's like the Lord says, I've given to you freely, and I expect you to freely give. The law didn't make me do this. I'm the fulfillment of the law. I did this by my own free will. I expect you to give freely too. Don't make it a law to be generous. Be free with your own resources.
And this is kind of the dynamic that we see in the culture today, right? Where the government basically accuses businessmen, and obviously there are generalizations and many, many, many millions of exceptions, but basically the narrative goes that private individuals and private businesses are greedy because they make money and they want to keep it. And the state is generous because they want to take that money by force and distribute it to people. But there's nothing generous about that. That's just a form of, armed robbery when you get right down to it. Actual generosity comes from the fact that people willingly give. And you'll often hear people say, well, the United States doesn't give nearly as much per capita to foreign aid. And my response to that is always, well, that may or may not be true for what the government gives. Right. But private American citizens are, I think, clearly the most generous people in the world.
That's right. That's right. That's when we get back to people's perception of greed. When you look at businesses, people, they'll see these prices and they'll accuse them of gouging and all that sort of stuff. I mean, economics 101, man, if I can quote Thomas Sowell, it's like, look, man, the best way to make money is to charge less. Greed is not a good wealth model. It doesn't pay off as well as charging people less. But at the same time, people can perceive that when a person tries to charge less, they'll accuse that person of trying to set up for a monopoly. Right? So, you're just trying to charge less, and now you're going to drive mom and pop stores out of business and all that sort of stuff. So once again, it comes down to the perception of greed and how people set their costs. It's like, man, you don't know what it costs for us to bring these products and services to you. Or if I can give another example, Bill, generosity can be demonstrated in Google. Google's been very generous with like how they set up, give you free email and give you a free drive where you can transfer files and stuff like that. That's very generous. But on the other side of their so-called generosity is that they're very greedy for control. And They are very greedy with controlling the narrative. So we can see that without some sort of fixed standard of virtue, then then generosity itself is not really definable.
Great. Now let's talk a little bit about real-world capitalism, because private businesses, as I say, people on the left tend to say that businessmen are greedy and government people are selfless. But just internally, if you're running a business, you can run a business with the spirit of generosity and also with the spirit of greed, especially when it comes to the people that you're employing and so on, right? I mean, there are some companies. Southwest comes to mind. I remember when, after 9/11, the president of Southwest Airlines said, "We're not firing anybody, and furthermore, I'm going to take $1 a year salary until we get out of this mess." Now, that is a genuinely generous act because he didn't have to do that. I mean, there was no requirement for him to do that. He could have basically said, well, it's not my fault that the economy that the airline travel's gone through the floor. I guess we're just going to have to fire some people. And that attitude from the top kind of permeates everything that happens downstream. And that attitude of generosity seems to make everybody downstream more or less happier and willing to work harder, while an attitude of greed just seems to do the opposite. That's how it looks to me.
Sure. Now, the thing is, it's easier to sell the opposite of that, in the culture. For some reason, Bill, oppression just sells better than, freedom. For some reason, it just does. But I think also with capitalism, it needs to be understood that capitalism isn't so much about how much money you make. And that's one of the things that the culture has a perception of where it comes to capitalism. And Jesus himself is quite the capitalist. It's like, look, man, these are your resources and you should be free to do with your resources. I encourage you to be generous, but these are your resources to be generous with. It's not property of the state. So, and you have a lot of so-called Christians out there who want to make a socialist model out of Jesus, and he spoke nothing of the sort. But the thing about capitalism, it's not about how much money you make. It's what the government is not free to take. And that's one of the things that's not really promoted. And people start to associate capitalism with greed and capitalism with putting profits before people and all that sort of stuff. When the real greed is when you institute covetousness and you think that you're going to benefit from what the state was able to take from the wealth makers and the job creators. And it's like, no, that doesn't work at all. That right there is a total institution of greed, whereas capitalism it gives you freedom to be generous and charitable and to be able to help people get out of a state where they need charity because there's jobs that can afford to hire them and stuff like that. That's what capitalism is able to help facilitate for people.
That's right. Yeah. And that's an entirely different model, not only different model of governance or economics, it's just a different model of people, right? On one hand, you have a model where the government takes just about everything and does this presumably in the name of virtue, sure, distributes it for its own particular benefits, and they always find a way to benefit. And people say, wow, that's an incredibly generous society. But what you find is that when people are allowed to keep as much money of their own money as possible, the more money of their own they get to keep, the more generous they become with it, the more they willingly give that money to causes that they were not required to give it to. And of all the things I see out there, it's this false definition of greed as you want to keep the work that you want to keep the fruits of the work that you've done. How greedy of you. Those belong to me. Right. Your work belongs to me, you greedy bastard. And then the other part of it is, look how generous we are because we're taking your money at gunpoint and distributing it in exchange for votes. So the whole thing is kind of backwards in that sense, I think, sure, in terms of the relationship between government and business.
Oh, definitely, man. And you're right, man. It's like, man, when you got some extra money in your pocket, man, who doesn't want to say, hey, bro, let me buy you a beer. Let's go out and get a burger, my treat and stuff like that. When you got some, it's like in our natural inclination to do things. And of course, people have a natural inclination to be selfish and stuff like that too. But, the thing about, thinking that the government is going to help facilitate people's generosity and stuff like that. That's just something that's sold on the culture. And, to have this capitalism, this bourgeois, capitalist, materialistic model that people think that they're gonna behave this way. Or let me just say this real quick, Bill. Capitalism itself really doesn't lend itself to corruption the way people think. Even if they're thinking that you're going to get money pro rosa or anything like that, or sub rosa, I should say. People are going to be more inclined to do that with a collectivist model. That's why we have crime syndicates. That's why you have things like the mafia, salvatrucha, triads, and things like that, because their government is so oppressive with what they take that people can't survive, and they start to resort to nefarious means to try to keep what it is that they have. Capitalism actually helps to prevent things like that. So it's really difficult to actually try to corrupt capitalism. Even if it is a so-called corruption of capitalism, that doesn't make it capitalism.
That's a profound point. That's a really great point. And people on the left often look at like the Soviet Union or communist societies as being so generous. But in point of fact, you're absolutely right. If all they do is produce shortages, then the end result is crime and black markets and hoarding and a real kind of a grasping death grip on whatever resources there are because there are so few of them. When you unleash the power of capitalism and people find themselves in abundance, relative abundance anyway, the more abundant they are and the more confident they are that abundance will continue because nobody's stepping in to take their stuff.
Right.
The more generous they become, the more actual wealth gets spread. And I think the bottom line in this case is, just to wrap it up, the happier they are.
Yes. Yes. And, but unless a person can deal with the dynamic of greed and the perception of greed, what they feel like they're entitled in, whatnot, that's a whole nother, that's when you're getting more, it's more than economics, it's more than politics, it's more than culture. That's when you're just getting down to a spiritual element of it, of what can actually satisfy you.
Satisfy you is the word. That seems to be the definition of the vices, the sins, and the antidote of all of these things is not only a cure for the sin, but the virtue of generosity is a source of happiness. There's nothing better than giving to people who you love and care about and seeing the reaction on their face. And it's just like, it's like everything else. It's kind of a polarity. You're going to go with the positive terminal or the negative terminal. So it's great to talk to you about these issues, and it'll be fun when we start getting into more specific ones, but that was just superb. And we're very glad to have you with us. And Alfonso Rachel's presence here is made possible by the new members who joined us recently at BillWhittle.com. We're very grateful to them and to the old members as always. So until next time, I'm Bill Whittle here with Alfonso Rachel, and this is The Virtue Signal.